Hey everyone, Justin Jolene here, and I'm excited to get into this masterclass, Stop Focusing on Trivial Running Biomechanics. Now, those of you that haven't gotten to know me yet, my name is Justin Jolene, and I'm a PT, and I've spent a lot of time in outpatient orthopedics, specifically sports medicine and working with runners. And I started a running gait analysis clinic that was able to help runners, and it was a cash-based business that was really fun to do. I'm also a faculty member at University of the Pacific and UC San Francisco, where I teach future PTs, and really teaching PTs how to work with runners is absolutely a dream for me. It combines my favorite things to do. Now, I'm also the chief editor of Solutions Education, and we provide the Running Clinical Specialist Certification, which teaches you how to work with runners and perform a running gait analysis, and also the Running Specialist Report, which takes the latest evidence on running research and condenses it down into an easy-to-read report with video tutorials and nice infographics and references for you to use in the clinic. So let's talk about what we'll get into in this masterclass. We'll of course talk about running biomechanics and their impact on running efficiency. We'll talk about things like cadence, vertical oscillation, vertical leg stiffness. But then we'll also talk about some of the things that might be surprising in terms of ground contact time, flight time, joint angles. And then lastly, what do we do to improve the running efficiency? What are our practical clinical applications? So I want you to think about this for a second. What are the most important biomechanics for runners? And you might be getting a list, maybe think of 3 to yourself, and if you need to even take a pause, take a pause. But it's really important to think about what are the most important biomechanics that you look for, because these are the things we prioritize. It's really important to know what to prioritize when we're working with runners. Okay, you got your list? Now, let's talk about the facts. So new research that's just emerging is actually talking that running economy is improved by higher cadence, low vertical oscillation, and high vertical leg stiffness. That's really important because these are the things we'd want to prioritize on a running gait analysis. These are the things we want to prioritize when we're working with runners. But here's the shocking part. Running economy is not correlated to ground contact time, flight time, or isolated joint angles, especially at the ankle, knee, and hip. We'll talk about this in a little more detail, but it doesn't mean that these things combined don't make a bigger picture for runners. We just don't have that research. What the research is showing is that individually, these things don't necessarily correlate to improving running economy. So let's get into this infographic here, and this is from some of the new research that's coming out. Let's specifically talk about lower and higher energy cost when we're running. And I want to highlight a couple things here. Now, I want to look at the very bottom under biomechanical differences here and look at increased cadence and decreased step length. And as you can see here, I don't need all of us to worry about the grades of evidence and the effect size, although we can see that's moderate and it's a higher effect size. I want to just point out that we see that higher cadence is going to decrease step length. It's going to make us a more efficient runner. Definitely something we want to look at. The other important thing here is going to be looking at some of the things that didn't have a huge effect. And that would be the foot strike angle at initial contact. That didn't really have an effect on overall running economy. Ankle dorsiflexion had a little bit of a trend, a little bit of a difference, but this wasn't really big enough to be a considerable correlation to running economy. Knee flexion, another big one. What we see is that knee flexion isn't having a strong correlation. Same thing with thigh and shank angle at initial contact. Oftentimes we think about that for runners. And again, I am not saying it's not something that we can put into context when we look at multiple joints, but isolated, we didn't see a huge change. So some really interesting things, especially at initial contact. Again, remember, hip, knee, ankle, those isolated joint angles aren't really what we really see are correlating. What we really see is some of the things that we talked about, in particular here, that cadence, higher cadences being really important. Okay, so at mid stance, what do we see? And here's the big one that I talked about earlier. Vertical oscillation. A lower vertical oscillation is going to be more efficient running. Now, we are seeing here that trunk flexion does have a correlation, although not a very big effect size. So we don't really see that we can take trunk flexion to the bank and say this is going to improve run economy for sure. The other thing that we see here that does improve running economy is vertical leg stiffness. So how much that patient is sinking down into each step, especially at mid stance, that's really important. The amount they go up and down, the amount they sink into their strides, that's going to make an effect on their overall running economy. And then again, we see that hip and knee range of motion, ankle range of motion is not as much correlated. So we want to take that and be able to help our runners more effectively. And lastly here, we do see ground contact time, duty factor not being big differences in terms of being able to correlate to running economy. Now we do have a pretty high effect size here, so that tells us that this is a pretty strong correlation. However, again, we want to keep it all in context. It doesn't mean that all of these things together don't make a bigger picture for us to look at the runner. I don't want you to stop looking at all these other things. I just want to share what the most important things that we see in the research are that are correlating to running economy. And then lastly, I just want to talk about it one more time about the hip, knee, and ankle angle. They aren't showing strong correlations, but there is one exception to the rule. Things aren't black and white, there are shades of gray, and that is that the ankle angle, especially at toe off, is important. And we do see some emerging trends here. With higher amounts of plantar flexion, we're noticing that the muscles get overly contracted. Those shortened muscles aren't as efficient to be able to push off. So we also see that the angle of plantar flexion is important. And with a higher angle of plantar flexion, we oftentimes see that people have more vertical displacement, more up and down motion, and potentially more wasted energy. So practitioners should use strength training and adjust cadence to improve running economy. Now, that's really some important things for us to think about, but I want to get into specifically how that works. So, in particular, let's talk about how the evidence supports using strength training. And the biggest thing is going to be plyometrics. Plyometrics is really, really important, and you can make some correlations here that running drills help with some plyometrics. There's also some evidence behind ballistic strength training as well. But the big thing here is that it's going to be high velocity multi-joint training. So essentially, we're going to be improving our inter-joint coordination. We're going to be improving our intermuscular coordination because we are going to be able to have all those muscles working efficiently. We see that's more effective than our single joint training under heavy resistance, primarily because that's going to be isolating one muscle and strengthening it, but it also creates some co-contractions that aren't very efficient. So we really want to see here the plyometrics, some of the impact loading, some of the learning how to jump the right way. Those things are really important for runners. And they are going to improve that vertical leg stiffness. So clinicians should progress sets and reps of plyometric exercises. Of course, we see that's a progression that we want to use. However, it's really important here because a lot of clinicians worry and wonder about overall dosaging. So how much do I give patients to do? How much do I start with? Well, here's a progression from beginner to intermediate to advanced. But the important thing is we want to watch and stop the exercise as soon as form deteriorates. We do not want to just let these patients go. We don't want to let these patients just go into fatigue because bad form, they're going to potentially hurt things, especially with a plyometric exercise. So we can start with things like squat jumps, maybe split squat jumps. And then we can progress that to things like skipping. We can progress it to lateral bounding. There's a lot of different exercises we can do. One of my favorites here is the single leg push-off box. And essentially, I really like this one because in the beginning phases, I want to be able to teach these runners, to teach these patients how to appropriately use the right muscles to be able to jump, to be able to use plyometrics. I want them to be able to push in a way that isn't going to compensate, that's not going to anterior load or posterior load or potentially use the wrong parts of the body. So I really like to get the mechanics isolated before I progress them. Then we get into things like a jump and reach or maybe a pike jump. And we add some lateral motion too, zigzag jumps and side-to-side push-offs. and a step from a box as well. So again, think of it this way. We're starting with some basic jumping. We're then getting to a little more reach jumping. We're getting into more side-to-side motions. We're getting into some tucks, some double leg tuck jumps, so getting extra motion. And then we really combine it all together. Depth jumping. So we're really going from a deep position to high position. Box jumps are important. Single leg stuff like single leg hops, single leg tuck jumps, and then we can add in multiple boxes too. Jump up on a box, jump down, jump up onto another box. And it doesn't reference it in here, but we can start using time as well. I like to start with slower time based things in the beginning and then use a metronome to be able to get them quicker and quicker and quicker and keep that really good form. Again, think about how we're going to work with runners. They are not going to slow down to take every step. They're going to run at the speed they're going to run at. So we want to be able to train their body and to improve their body's strength in those specific speeds. So let's pause one more time here, and I want to ask you, how do you adjust cadence? And this is going to be what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time together today. Because a cadence is so important that adjusting it, we need to do it in an evidence-based way. So what do? Do you just take a calculation of their cadence and then say, well, let's up it by 10 or 15 or 20 or whatever it is? How do you go about adjusting cadence? What's your criteria to adjust cadence? Cadence is a big topic, and that's exactly what I want to talk about right now. So let's first talk about reduced step rates and increased step rates. And this is a big chart and a really good research article to get into. This is some important information because we can see with reduced step rates on a generalistic level, we see longer step length. We see longer ground contact times. We're going to see increased flight as well, and more vertical displacement up and down. That's also going to have higher braking forces. It's also going to have more impact. And it's also going to make, generally speaking, the hip and pelvis work more. We're going to see increased glute activity. We're going to see increased hip activity as well on a general scale. We're going to see a lot of these things are working a lot more. And we also see the foot and ankle are working more and the knee are working more too. Oftentimes with that lower step rate, we're going to see higher peak patellar forces because there's more impact going through the body. It's a longer step rate. Longer step length. But increased step rates are going to decrease a lot of these things. It's going to make the muscles not work as hard. It's going to decrease the step length. It's going to decrease the amount of impact going through the body. It's going to decrease the force on the knee. It's going to decrease the force on the foot. It's going to decrease the force on the hip and pelvis. But here's one important thing to think about. And that is, I know that I mentioned before that duty cycle, overall, we don't have strong correlations that show it improves running economy. However, one thing I do want to think about is as we're talking about cadence, it's important to think of how many steps the patient is running on the ground. And as that runner takes more steps, that's more opportunities for loading. So do we have a high amount of steps outweighed by a decreased amount of steps at a higher impact and higher working rate? And there's obviously a place in between that's really appropriate for folks. So we want to think about that balance. And honestly, there's a lot of new research that is going on in this area, and more research is truly needed. But it's something that we should think about as clinicians, so we start to use our clinical reasoning to be able to help patients with that. So adjusting cadence. This is super fun. I love adjusting cadence because it's really quite effective, especially for short-term gains. So practitioners should look to adjust cadence to improve running economy. And this is going to decrease step length and vertical oscillation. But be careful, because you want to consider the current cadence they're running at, and their leg length is important too. Their height, their weight, all those things are important. So how do we adjust cadence? And here's a nice infographic for you. So we have low, medium, and higher cadences, and I want to familiarize ourselves with what low means. And if you don't know yet, low typically means under that 164 or 165. We consider that lower cadence. However, the average running cadence is only 164. That's a lot of patients that are running with a lower cadence. And I use patients there in particular because there's a chance if they're having those high impact loads that they might become patients for us at some point. But to say it seriously, a lot of runners are at a lower cadence. So what do we see? Those lower cadences have an increased chance for tibial pain. And then they also are going to most benefit from increasing cadence. Now, slower runners are naturally going to have a lower cadence, while faster runners are going to naturally have a higher cadence. But this is important things to think about. So on the higher cadence side, we notice 180 tends to be our kind of rule for high cadence. It's a sliding scale, but 180 is pretty high cadence. So if someone says, I need to run at 180 steps per minute, you can say, well, the research doesn't necessarily support that. What the research does support is that unfortunately 180 is too high for most runners, but we do look at different body types. Maybe a shorter leg length, maybe a faster running speed. Maybe they are at that 180, maybe even a little higher. I've certainly seen runners go over 180. However, it doesn't mean locked in stone that that's appropriate for them. Now, the other thing that's important to think about is that those higher cadence runners don't necessarily benefit as much from increasing cadence, especially if they are already having a little bit of a shortened stride length, things like that. So let's find our Goldilocks. Let's find the medium. What is the medium? Well, the medium is going to be finding a cadence that's appropriate for these patients. We know that a little bit of a higher cadence, especially compared to the average of 164, is good for a lot of patients. Now, what do we do to increase that? Well, usually we're telling patients to increase by 5 to 10% of their preferred step rate. That's a good place to start. And I would even tell you start lower and then build up. We can always go higher, but we can't always go lower because patients sometimes think they need to be running at 180, which is absolutely not true. And we also know that those cadences are going to decrease their stride length and decrease the vertical oscillation. One of the best ways we can do this is going to be using a metronome. And even better is using some music as an auditory gait retraining tool to be able to help runners run at a specific speed. But before we go on, look at my words in red at the bottom. And that is adjusting cadence is really good for short-term pain relief. We'll talk about the specific diagnoses in a second. However, we don't really know the long-term effects. And that's where we get into saying continual follow-ups, checking in, reassessing patients and runners is really helpful. Make sure they're running the right way. Make sure that they're not injuring themselves. We know that higher cadences have good short-term effects. It's actually one of the quickest ways to be able to help runners improve running form. But is that truly a long-term option? We're not sure. More research is truly needed. So adjusting cadence, I want to just highlight here 5 to 10% of an increase of the runner's preferred step rate for the appropriate patients. We know that is going to decrease the overall impact, decrease stride length. And then we also can see that using a metronome or setting music to a specific beat is really effective. And it's going to be more effective for those folks that are a lower cadence to start with. Also, we know there's specific things that really help for adjusting cadence for, and that would be your Achilles tendinopathy, patellofemoral pain syndrome, glute tendinopathy as well. Those are going to provide short-term pain relief, but we're still not sure if they can actually provide long-term pain relief. So some really, really good options of things we can do for patients, especially as they come in. With the Achilles tendinopathy, we notice that that is going to decrease their vertical oscillation. We know that that's going to require less plantar flexion strength and less tension out of the Achilles tendon. We also know that the long step length is going to affect patellofemoral pain by increasing pressure under the patella. And then lastly, glutes. We know the glutes activate a lot with longer step rates. We know they're higher engagement, so their muscles are being used more and potentially aggravate that gluteal tendinopathy. So we know that increasing the cadence is going to help with pain for these folks. Now, thank you for joining for this masterclass. I hope you got something out of it. There's tons of infographics we can send. A lot of this information was off the Running Specialist Report. So if you're interested, go ahead and check that out. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Reply to an email. Go ahead and just send me one. I'll answer the question and make sure I get back to you personally. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll see you soon.